over the last course sections, the learning curve got a bit steeper, and we had a look at more advanced yet crucial React concepts, especially, of course, when we had a look at React hooks like useEffect, useContext, and also useReducer. Therefore, before we dive deeper into React, this course section is there for you to practice what you learned together with me by building another course project, the food order app. Now, of course, we have demos in all course sections, but this is another slightly bigger application where all the key things you learned throughout the last course sections again come together and can be seen in the context of a bigger project. And of course, we're not just going to have a look at those concepts covered in the last section, but we will again see all core React features in action, including components, state, and much more. Now, this is the application we are going to build. It's a simple dummy food order app where we got a list of meals from which we can choose, and we can then add these meals to the cart, also change their amounts, and also add them multiple times. And of course, we can also view the cart to see what's in the cart here. We can also change our cart from that page if we want to. And ultimately, we can, of course, also click order, though for the moment, that won't do anything. Instead, it will just add a little output here in the console, but we will of course also have a closer look at how we can store that in a database or do other things with that later in the course. But for the moment, this application is there to practice all those key features we had a look at over the last course sections. Now, if you feel like it, you can of course also try this on your own. Attached to this lecture, you find all the CSS files I plan to use throughout this section, and these file names also give you an idea of which components I plan to use, but this is totally optional. It is a nice practice, but it will also be a big challenge. Therefore, it might definitely be worth a try, but we can also simply walk through all of that together to again practice all these key concepts step by step together to make sure that after this course section, everything we learned up to this point is super clear. So let's get started building this project together now. For this, attached you find this basic starting project here, which is just again an empty React application pretty much. And you can download this attachment, extract it, place it anywhere on your system where you want to work on it, run npm install in the extracted folder to install all dependencies, and then npm start to bring up that development server. And if you do all of that, what you'll see on the screen is just something like this, because we're going to build this project together from the ground up. And that of course means that we'll build many components and that we'll practice many things which we learned early in the course already, because components and passing data between components and managing state and all of that of course are crucial core fundamentals of React, so we will need those in any project we build. But then, throughout this course section, we're also going to apply all these other hooks we had a look at, like useEffect. So that's the plan for this module. Now, to get started with this application here, we will need a bunch of components. And if you remember the finished app which I showed you before, if you have a look at that, there of course are quite a few components that can be identified, like that list of meals, or the header at the top, or the card, but also a couple of wrapper components like this general modal component, this overlay component, or this container our meals are in. We also got this image below the header, so there are quite a bit of components involved. Now, to get started, here I will again add a components folder, of course, and in that components folder, I will add 4 subfolders, which is just a personal decision made by me, and I'll explain it along the way. One subfolder is the UI subfolder. I want to place general UI elements, general UI components in that folder. For example, I will have an input component in there where the user can enter the amount in this application. I will have a card component in there, which will be this container around my meals, for example. And I plan to place the modal component in that folder. So some general UI components which are not tied to a specific feature of this application, but which instead could be used in multiple places in any project. I will also add another folder side by side to the UI folder, and that will be the layout folder. Now in that folder, I plan to add my header component basically, and also another component which will be related to that header. Another folder which I will add side by side to layout and UI is the meals folder. That is the folder which will hold that list of meals, but also the individual meal item components. And then the last folder for the last set of components I plan to build is the cart folder, which will hold all the cart related components. So that is just the structure I came up with here. Of course, it's not the only correct structure. Of course, you can go for a different structure and store your components the way you want and write the components you want to write. This is just my suggestion because I think that this is a nice split to split our components between features, meals and cart, and also have some general UI components and some general layout components. Now, of course, we're going to populate these folders step by step throughout this module. I want to start with the header for now, so with this toolbar at the top. And therefore, in the layout folder here, I will add a header.js file. And that will hold my header code. The header will also need some styling, so side by side to header.js, I will add a header.module CSS file. .module because I will use the built-in CSS modules support which modern React projects created with Create React App, which this setup is in the end, provide. So this CSS file will be needed. And speaking of that file, you find this header.module CSS file attached to this lecture, and you can simply replace yours with it or simply copy in all the provided styles, which are some styles I came up with to give this header the look you saw in the preview at the beginning of this module. Of course, you can also write your own styles if you prefer that. Now in the header.js file, we want to have the JSX structure for our header. And therefore here I will export a header component function where we get some props. And of course, we'll also, export this function to make it available outside of this file because I will use it in a different file. And inside of this component function, I don't need complex logic or state or anything like that. Instead, there I will just return the JSX code for this header. And here I actually want to have two blocks of code. One block of code will be the header itself, so that toolbar. The second part will be the image below the header. Though we could also split that into two separate components if we wanted to. Here I will keep it in one component, but again, that is definitely a split you could also make. Have two components instead of one. Now here I will use a React fragment, so that built-in fragment component, and therefore I want to import React from React so that I can access React fragment. Alternatively, we of course just import fragment and use that directly as a component like this. And I'm using this fragment component as a wrapper because we must only have one root element returned here. That's true for any place where you use JSX. You must only have one root element. And in there, I actually want to have two sibling elements. A header, using the built-in header component, and then a div, which will hold the image. And again, that would be the two components you could also separate into separate component files and functions. Here, I'll keep it in one component though. Now, inside of the header here, which is a default HTML5 element, I'll have a H1 element where I'll say React Meals, which is just the name of this application I came up with. Of course, you can choose any name you want. And then, side by side to that, I want to have a button which will open the cart later. So for the moment, I'll just add a button with the name of cart like this. I will change this code in a couple of seconds or minutes though. Before we change that button though, let's have a look at that div. And in that div, I want to have an image. So the built-in image element. And here I'm providing an image to you, which you find attached as well. And I will add an assets folder in the source directory, so next to components, where this image will actually be stored in. So attached you find that meals JPEG file, and I will just copy that into that assets folder. This is an image which is provided locally as part of the React application. Now, how can we use that image here in this JSX file? Well, we can use this image in a way which could look strange when you first see it, but which is very easy to use once you're used to it. You can simply import images, and it's a bit like importing CSS files. It's not really a JavaScript feature, but instead, imports like that, so importing CSS files or importing images, is supported by this project setup which we're using here. And behind the scenes, the import is simply transformed to include the image in the finished application, which we could deploy to a server, and to generate a link to that image, which is then dynamically inserted in the generated code. So there's a lot of behind the scenes magic going on here. For us, we simply import meals image, though this name is up to you, from going up, assets, meals JPEG. And here the file extension matters, just as for CSS files, because this tells that build process that this is not a JavaScript file, but in this case an image file, and that it therefore should be transformed and injected appropriately behind the scenes. And then we can use this imported image as a source here by binding the source dynamically with curly braces and pointing at meals image. This is how you can include a local image. Of course, if this would be an image on some server and you simply had a URL to that image, you could just add that URL to some image. To some image.jpg. You could add that if you had such a URL. But here, since it's a local image, part of the project, we instead use that other approach. Now we can also add an alt text, a table full of delicious food, something like this. And with that, I got the general structure for this header component finished. Though there are things missing. For example, the styling. Here on the header component, on the header element, I want to add a class name. And since we added this CSS file, which uses CSS modules, we import classes from that module.css file, so from header module.css. And here, as a class name for the header, we should point at classes.header. Because in that CSS file, if you have a look at it, there is a header CSS class defined. And as you learned in the styling section, this is how you use CSS modules then. Now on that div, which holds the image, I'll also add a class name. And here it's classes main image written like this. Since it's a CSS class with a dash inside of it, we can't use the dot notation. And that's simply another CSS class defined in there. Now with that, the general header structure is finished. With that, we can now go to app.js, to our root component, and there we can import header from /components layout header like this. And then instead of this h2 tag here, I will use my header. And actually, I also don't want that div here anymore. Instead here, for the moment, I will just use a fragment, which I of course need to import from React. The React import itself is missing here because, as you learned, you can omit that in modern React projects like this one. You can always add it as well, though. You can always also import React from React, and it won't hurt either. Technically, it's required because of what JSX is transformed to behind the scenes, but in some project setups like this one, you can simply omit it. And with that, if you saved it, you should have that header here. And this is a good start. This is now our toolbar. Of course, the card button in the header doesn't look at all like the button you saw in the preview, though. And therefore, that's what we're going to work on next. So let's work on this button in the header. And we could add all the JSX code in here. I will create a separate component for this, though. Again, you could do the same for the image here, by the way, but I will leave the image in here actually, since that's not a lot of JSX code. But I will create a separate component for the header card button. So header card button.js is my file name here. And we could create that component in the header.js file as well, since we're only going to use it in that file. But I want to keep that file lean and not bloated. Therefore, I will follow this common convention of creating a separate file. We will also need some styling, and for this attached you find a header card button.module.css file, which you can simply copy into your layout folder. And this includes some styles for this button. And then in the JS file for the header card button, I will add my header card button function, my component function, which receives props. And of course, also export it like this. And then let's work on the JSX code for the button. For this here, I want to return a button, of course. And inside of that button, I now want to have an icon, then some text, and then a little badge with the current number of items in the cart. Therefore, I will add 3 spans in there. The first one will wrap the icon, the second one the text, and the third one the badge. And when it comes to this icon, I also got a finished component for you, which you can use. And that's the cart icon.js file, which you could add to the layout folder, because that's where we use it. So this would make sense. But which you can also add to the cart folder, because of course it is an icon specifically for the cart. And whilst in this application, we will only use it in the header card button, you could be using it in other parts of the app as well. And therefore you might want to store it in the feature folder, in the cart folder, instead of the layout folder. But that is totally up to you. Either way, this attached cart icon.js file simply holds an SVG icon and not much more. And you can use that to, well, render this cart icon. So therefore here, back in the header card button.js file, I simply want to import cart icon from, going up one level, cart icon. So I import it as a regular component because it is a regular functional component. And then here, in this span, I will add cart icon like this as a self-closing component. So it's a regular React component, even though it holds SVG. Because that is something you can do in React. You can use SVG code in your JSX code as well. Now, in the second span, I will have a text of your cart. And in the third span, I want to output the total amount of items in the cart. And for the moment, we don't have the logic for counting this yet. So therefore here for the moment, I will just hard code it. Let's say 3 as a dummy value. Now we will need some styles. So therefore here I will import classes from the header card button module.css file. And then on the button itself, we can add a class which should be classes.button. Then on that span with the icon, I will add a class of classes.icon. And of course, these again, button, icon, and so on, these again are just predefined CSS classes in that CSS file. And for the badge, we therefore add classes.badge. If we do that, we can now use this header card button in the header.js file. Here, I want to replace this button with it, so therefore, I will simply import header card button from /header card button like this. And then here, simply add header card button. And now if you save everything, you should have a button that looks like this in your header. If it doesn't look like this, definitely download and compare my code snapshot because, well, this is all just JSX and CSS working together right now. So you should definitely have an output like this. The button, of course, doesn't do anything yet, but that is something we will add throughout this module. But for the moment, we therefore are done with that header. We added this header, it's finished now, and now we can work on the next parts of this application. So what's next? Of course, this is generally up to you, but here I want to continue with the meals, because of course that is a rather important part of this application. And for that, in the meals folder, I'll add a meals.js file. And this will be responsible for, in the end, rendering that meals list. Though actually not just the list of meals, but also this little summary text above it. And therefore, I will actually add two other components here, which split these responsibilities. I will add a meals summary.js file, which will render this text above the list of meals. And I'll render an available meals component, which will then be responsible for bringing the actual list of meals to the screen. Now let's maybe start with the meals summary component. For that, you attached find a CSS file, meals summary.module.css. And in the meals summary component file, in the JS file, as always, we just export a component. Now this will be a very simple component because it will just contain some hard-coded JSX code. It doesn't even need to accept the props parameter because we will not be using props here at any time. And here I just want to return a section, let's say, where we have a h2 tag where we say delicious food delivered to you. And then a couple of paragraph texts with some text below it. Now, to save you the extra typing, attached you find that meals summary.js file finished, and there you got these paragraphs already added, and you also got a class name added, and therefore here I need to add the import again. You already have that in the attached file, where I import meals summary.module.css like this, and then add this summary class here, like this. Now again, you find this finished meals summary.js file attached because it is a very simple file. More interesting, of course, is the available meals file. Here we can have the available meals function. We also don't need props here actually, because I won't receive any props here. Instead, here in this application, we will work with some dummy meals data, which is baked into this component. That's of course a bit unrealistic, but we will later in the course learn how we could fetch data from a database. At the moment, we don't know it yet, and therefore we will work with such dummy data. Speaking of that, attached you find the dummy meals.js file, and that includes a simple constant, which you should add in this file above the available meals component function, which is this dummy meals. constant, which holds an array of dummy meals. Again, that is that dummy data we're going to work with in this demo application. Now with that added here in the available meals component, we want to render this array of meals, which we of course could have fetched from some database or anything like that in reality. We want to render this as JSX. And therefore, we will need to transform this regular array of JavaScript objects to an array of JSX elements. And that is something you, of course, learned throughout the course. That is something you can do easily with React. So here we want to return some JSX code, let's say with a section inside of it. And then inside of this section, I want to have an unordered list. And inside of this unordered list, I want to have my meals list. And therefore, we can add curly braces and then refer to dummy meals and map them into an array of JSX elements. Now, we can do this here, and we did do this here in the JSX code in the past. But to keep this return statement lean, I will actually create a helper constant here, which I'll name meals list, which simply stores that mapped dummy meals list here, so that down there I just output meals list. That's exactly the same as if I would be doing it down there. It just ensures that this JSX snippet is a bit leaner. And it's totally up to you if you wanna do this transformation here and store it in a constant which you use down there, or if you do the transformation inline in your JSX block. Either way, we will simply map all these meals by passing a function to map, which is executed for every meal by JavaScript. And then for every meal, we want to return a JSX element which represents this meal item. And that should be some list item, of course. Though I can already say for the moment, we can simply output meal.name here, like this, but that's just temporary. We will soon create a separate component for the meal item. But for the moment, we can leave it like this and finish this first draft of the available meals component by adding some styling. Now for this, again, attached you find the available meals.module.css file with some predefined CSS code. And in the available meals.js file at the very top, you simply import classes from available meals.module.css. And then on this section, we can add a class name of classes.meals. And now with that, we can go back to the meals component, which should now group the meals summary and available meals together. So here, the meals component will again also be very simple. It won't need any props either. Here, we just want to import the two other components. So the meals summary from meals summary like this, and import available meals from available meals like this, and then return both side by side. And since I want to return two elements side by side, you know that this is not possible in JSX. We must only have one root JSX element, and therefore again I will use the fragment. So we should import fragment from React as a wrapper component around meals summary as a self-closing component and available meals as a self-closing component. And now with that, we can go to the app.js file, and here below the header, I will add a main HTML element, which is a default built-in HTML5 element. And inside of that main element, I will add my meals. So I will import meals from components, meals, importing the meals JavaScript file in the meals folder, and then simply render this here as a self-closing component. And if you save that, you should see something like this. Now the summary already looks good. Of course, the list of meals doesn't, but here we are also just getting started. Now, as a next step, I want to wrap this entire list here, this unordered list, into a card component. So into a container with rounded corners and a white background and so on. And every list item itself should also become a separate component, which also outputs more data and in a nicer way. Now that's what we're going to do in the next lecture. Of course, as always, feel free to not proceed right away, but try this on your own first. Even if it then looks different than what we're going to build in the next lecture, this is a great practice you can and you maybe should do before you proceed, and we do it together next.